time zone you are in. As we allow people to join, please let us know where you're coming from. And also feel free to say hi in the chat with your favorite emoji. Hello. I see our numbers scale up really quickly. We'll just give it a couple of more minutes so everyone can join and we can all start this incredible webinar. I see a lot of hellos. Could some people say hello in their own languages? I would love to see the diversity we have here. I see people from Chile. I see bonjour. I see South Africa. That's incredible. Uganda. Whoa, I'm loving all this diversity. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Valeria Colunga. I myself am from Monterrey, Mexico, so I am happy to be part of this incredible event. And today we are talking about an incredible topic. But beforehand, let me just finish my introduction. So, my name is Valeria Colunga. I am the Executive Strategy Officer of Southern Voice, a network of 71 think tanks from the Global South. And also, I'm a UN Foundation Next Generation alumna. It is my pleasure to be your host today and MC as we kickstart our first engine room pit stop of the year. If you didn't know, the Engine Room for the Future is a digital intergenerational platform led by young people to reimagine how the UN thinks, plans, and acts for the future. We run youth-led projects and host dialogues to advance SDG implementation. These dialogues we call pitstops, and they are strategically held ahead of key UN processes. Last year, we engaged over 3,600 participants and reached an incredible 1.7 million people across the globe. This is our first pit stop of the year, so welcome. This year's engagement is more focused and strategic, with 5 streamlined engine room pit stops aligned with major global moments, including the World Social Summit and Beijing Plus 30. Additionally, there are 5 youth-led action projects that are driving real-world change, with key issues like finance, climate, gender, technology, and peace building. The Engine Room is expanding its reach with Our Future India. This first regional initiative will feature a national youth survey, a design challenge, and a campaign film. Our Future India's goal is to engage young voices to ensure the perspective of them is influencing the country's trajectory towards 2047. But now, the Engine Room is sharpening its advocacy on financing for the future, which is what we're here for today. We're striving for a major push at the Financing for Development Conference in Spain, which for short we will call FFD4, and you will hear about it today. To ensure these discussions are more accessible to everyone in the room, the Our Future Agenda program is launching today a new series of explainers that break down complex financial issues and also unpack FFD4. These are fact-based guides that explain debt, taxation, and climate funding into very simple, engaging, and also solution-oriented content. You can find them in our Trello, and we'd love to hear what you think. Let's start talking about financing for development. Did you know that to achieve the SDGs by 2030, we need to mobilize an additional 2.5 trillion annually? And with a reduction of development aid, as we have seen in the past few weeks, there is an even greater need to mobilize resources and be more strategic about their allocation. Right now, in many of the world's youngest nations, where 50 to 80% of the population is under 30, governments are forced to spend 5 times more on debt than on their own people. Think about what that means. Imagine being told there is simply not enough money for your education, or for your healthcare, or for your future, because it's all being used to repay loans taken out decades ago under very unfair terms. To me, that's just not bad economics. It's straight up intergenerational injustice. This is why the Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, FFD4, is such a big deal. In Southern Voice, we're seeing Global South think tanks make a call in the multilateral system to see concrete financial reforms. For example, some think tanks are calling the G20 to accelerate reform on the common framework for debt treatment. to be more equitable and meet its environmental, social, and human rights commitments. Some proposals for the framework's revision include to adopt a debt sustainability analysis, which would categorize countries by distress level and require debt relief. As well, to place a temporary standstill on debt services during negotiations to encourage increased private creditor involvement. So, to sum it up, the FFD4 is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to push for real reforms that will determine whether young countries can break free from debts that have been putting them aside from actually investing in their future. But as one of our Southern Voice think tanks said, FFD4 will just be like any other conference if it makes big commitments with no action plan, timeline, or structure. So, over the next 90 minutes, we'll unpack these very critical questions with a powerful lineup of experts and young leaders. We will start with a spotlight exchange featuring a distinguished UN official and a young champion on financing challenges and solutions for young countries. We will then move straight into our intergenerational power panel, bringing together globally recognized leaders to talk about bold, actionable strategies to financial reform. Afterwards, we will turn the mic to you for our Q&A session, where I would love to hear what you have to say about the topic. And finally, we'll be wrapping up. We will have one of the most talented young poets performing a spoken word on financing for development. I cannot wait for you to hear her perform. So let's start. I would like to introduce our special guest, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin and Maureen. Can you see me? Okay, I will introduce them right away. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin. Dr. Mahmoud is an economist, a global leader in finance, investment, and sustainable development. He has served as Egypt's Minister of Investment and held senior roles at the World Bank Group, where he has led efforts on poverty reduction, economic growth, and financing for development. Currently, he is the United Nations Special Envoy on financing the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, leading the United Nations Secretary General's group of experts on debt crises. With his deep expertise in global finance and policy reform, we're honored to have him here to share insights on the building of a fair financial system. And we also have with us Maureen Makungu, a passionate young champion from Zambia and an events coordinator with Bloom and Beyond. As an active member of Child Budget Network and Children's Parliament, she led several engagement meetings with policymakers at the national level to lobby for improved spending on children's programs. Maureen is a powerful voice for young people, and we are very excited to have her here with us today. So, audience, let's welcome our amazing speakers with a round of digital applause. And during that discussion, you will be able to post following questions after we finish the discussion. So let's start with Maureen, if that's okay. Hello, Maureen.
Hi.
Hi. So I know you're an active member of the Child Budget Network, and you probably have seen firsthand how debt diverts away from critical youth programs and education. So I would love to know if you can share some specific examples on how this impacts young people in your country, and what message you would like to give decision makers on this.
Thank you very much for the question. The debt crisis is something that we all can't run away from. It's really hit our country, Zambia, very restructuring process that took place recently, and it has helped minimize how much our country has to spend on debt. But it still hasn't really changed anything because we still face challenges when it comes to different sectors that affect us young children in our country. When we talk about education, we face a lot of challenges in the education sector where there are no desks in schools, we do not have books in schools, there are no desks to sit on. We have, when we talk about the people with disabilities, because they have no care at all. And not only at education, we look at health. We have no hospitals in our country that focus on children, and it's really terrible when you find a child that's really sick standing in a line with grown-ups, and what if the child is going to die? So these are reasons that are causing to the increase of death in children in our country. We also look at lack of medicines in hospitals. These are problems that are hitting us very badly. Another challenge I can also point out is the social cash transfer, where families living in poverty are not getting enough money to look at their children. Back then, the country used to give a certain amount of money to families living in poverty, but looking at how far the cost of living is in the country now, families are no longer able to survive even on the small amount of money that they're given. Those are some of the challenges that we're facing. When we also look at programs that are youth-led, this is something that has really impacted us to the point where we cannot host meetings because there are no funds. The country doesn't have enough funds. Last year, we were not able to host a proper budget session within our schools because the school wasn't able to give us any money to engage other pupils in. Those are like some of the challenges that we are facing as young ones now.
Thank you. That's very insightful. And I think it's really interesting to hear from firsthand experiences on how this actually affects people's lives. So, Dr. Mohieldin, let's turn to you. You have been a leading voice in global finance, and now with your appointment to the UN Secretary General's expert group on debt crisis, you are tackling this issue at the very highest level. So could you please tell us why is that such a big challenge for countries with young populations? And what can be done to ensure they have access to sustainable financing without falling again into cycles of debt dependency? We would love to hear your insights.
Right. Thank you so much, Valerie, for the kind invitation, the kind words. And it's great to listen to Maureen as well, because in her insightful comments, she summarized very well the implications of debt on population, especially on the young segments of the population, those who are in school and those who need attention by health services, those who would need essential support through the budget of the state. And if we have, as it is happening now in many developing economies, including African countries, that the service on debt is more than what we spend on education, health, and essential services put together, the examples that Maureen just mentioned are basically going to be even more in the future. And that's why we're trying to deal with the silent crisis, as the World Bank call it, because while Maureen was very much outspoken about the problem, well, unfortunately, unlike other debt crises in the past that we have seen in Latin America and the emerging markets crisis in the 1990s and episodes of debt challenges in Africa, this current crisis doesn't really have adequate attention by the international community. And it's not just the problem of default that some countries face, like Zambia or Ethiopia or Chad or Sri Lanka. It's actually the countries that are trying to avoid the default in their payment by defaulting almost on everything else, by defaulting on what they spend on education, on health, and on the sustainable development goals. Just to put matters in context and where exactly that is coming in that bigger picture. We agree that sustainable development goals are important, that this had been signed by the leaders of states back in 2015 in a special summit, ending extreme poverty, improving education, enhancing the quality of health services, empowering women, providing job opportunities, dealing with the climate challenges, to the rest of the SDGs that we all know. But in order to achieve the SDGs, and we are a few months away from the Finance for Development Conference to be hosted in Seville in Spain. So just to summarize the Finance for Development, that is very much needed as an enabler for funding the SDGs. They are public and private finance, domestic and external sources need to be included with adequate debt management, with better role for trade, and dealing with what's called STI, science, technology, and innovation. That all needs to be supported with adequate infrastructure for global finance, or what is so-called the international financial architecture. This is basically, in a few seconds, what do we mean by finance for development. So if you are asked, but I hope that you will read the documents coming from Addis a few years ago in 2015, and the outcome documents in terms of the drafts being prepared now with good participation by youth participants, but we definitely need more of youth participation, because this is basically about you. This is a framework that's going to be hopefully blessed in July in this year, and this is going to be impacting the framework from now until 2035. By the time all of our listeners today will be graduating from schools and universities, they are going to be employed. So they need really to be very much prepared for that. That is part of the bigger story. That in itself is not a problem. It's the way that we spend it. Are we spending it on good quality education and health, or we are spending it on consumption, public consumption? Are we spending that on essential infrastructure and digital infrastructure, or we are getting new debt to pay back all debt? So that means, are the terms of debt adequate or not? That needs as well to be dealt with. In terms of the maturity of debt, is it long-term debt for 20, 30 years with concessional elements, or is it commercial debt that you need to repay in 2 or 3 years? Is your debt vulnerable to shocks like foreign exchange dynamics and shocks, or is it immune against that? So the job of that group that you mentioned, Valerie, is basically about putting solutions for the current debt challenges and crises facing some countries, but more is putting that in a kind of a sustainable framework to prevent any kind of negative spillovers from debt service, with negative implications on what we should really be doing better for the investments of our human capital, for investments in nature and dealing with climate challenges, and for getting our population, especially the young population, ready for the best thing that could happen, which is basically artificial intelligence, digital transformation, but we need to be ready to optimize the positives of AI and digital transformation.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And thank you for breaking down the complexity of the topic, because I think you very much well explained the multiple aspects that we need to take into consideration to try to tackle this challenge from the head on. So I would like to make one last question to you, and then go back to Maureen. Maureen, I will be asking you the same question, so please feel free to start thinking about what you would like to answer to this. So as we get closer to the Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, I would like to know, what is one key action that global leaders must take to make sure that young people and young countries aren't left behind? And what can young people do to make their voices heard in this space? If you could give us just an insight of a minute or two, that would be great. We want to know what is the type of message that we should be promoting from now onwards.
Thank you so much, Valerie. It's exactly through what you are doing now. But what we need to do is basically, after the discussion that you'll be having and the good inputs, including that of Maureen earlier, is to be reflected in a way that you can really use it and communicate directly with the preparers of the outcome document of the Finance for Development Conference to be hosted in Seville in Spain in June and July of this year. Yes, as I said, there is some good participation by young segments of society, university students, pupils in schools, but it's not adequate enough. And actually, you need as well, not just the direct communication with the UN system, and there is an open space for that, is through the communication with your representatives, with your government officials. There is going to be a preparatory meetings in April. Make sure, please, that you contact your members of parliament and ministers, those who are going to be going and participate in the PrEP.com in April in New York, that they are reflecting your priorities. Make sure that the budget of the state with its problems today are being tackled through what you are talking about, because it's not just about foreign aid, which is really suffering, as we know today, from the political dynamics, but basically from domestic resource mobilization, how to harness the flows of capital, how to deal with debt, how to make sure that trade is with greater value, not just exporting some raw material from Zambia or from Egypt, but it's basically thinking of a system and provide solutions, not just to put the problems, but there are many great solutions, especially from youth entrepreneurs. And please, as much as we can, secure funds to have youth representatives in Seville in Spain. We have a very gracious host, Spain, taking matters very seriously. Make sure that you're adequately represented, not just in the meeting rooms, but in the activities around it in June as well. And finally, in this kind of global environment, there are many good solutions that takes a kind of a regional perspective and local perspective. And it's good that the African voice through Maureen today is being heard, but there are many good things that we can do with the new leadership of the African Union. The same could be said about Latin America, about Asia, about the rest of the countries of the global South. And use the power that you have better than anyone, which is basically social media, and your presence in social media to summarize your voice, articulate that, and make sure that your voice is being heard, and make sure as well that all of these commitments are going to be subject to good, effective accountability, because we have been listening for many times now about good promises coming from here and there, but there have been always question marks about credibility of delivery.
We hear you. I think we will take so many of these recommendations and ideas back home and think about how we can implement this with ourselves, but also with our friends.
And if I may, I'm sorry to take much time. We are aware of the tough environments in the political system today. I think you need really to start by what Maureen mentioned at the beginning, the implications of debt. If you cannot bring me benefits, at least stop the harm. Stop the harm of debt. Stop the harm of illicit flows. Many of African countries today and developing economies pay more to the rest of the world than what they get. Stop the harm of the emissions coming from the mitigations, and stop the harm of the spillovers of some of the policies adopted by some advanced economies that have serious implications on our exporters, our employers, and hence us all in our societies and communities.
Thank you, Dr. Mohieldin. Thank you. Maureen, I would love to go back to you. What is one key action global leaders must take to ensure that young peoples and young countries aren't left behind? And what can young people like ourselves do to make our voices be heard in this space? I think we lost Maureen. Well, while she comes back, if she does, hopefully she does, I would like to make a quick summary of what we have heard from this very insightful conversation. So first of all, we heard from Maureen what the real life in-ground experiences of facing debt face on. And I think one of the more interesting aspects of this is what Dr. Mohieldin was saying, that we young people have the ability and also kind of the responsibility to talk with our government, talk with our members of parliament, talk with our representatives, and use these real life experiences to showcase the importance of tackling debt. And this is also why I think it's so important to have this type of conversations, because not only do we need to understand what Dr. Mohieldin said, which is the more complex aspects of debt, but we also need to understand how debt will have an impact not only in our lives today, but also in our lives 10, 20, 30 years from now. And what better way to start doing something about it than today? And of course, use the resources that are available today, such as the Trello and the explainers that I mentioned before, and also to use our own community, which we are right now developing live in our webinar chat, to see how we can better connect and better use our common efforts to actually tackle this issue. So I think Maureen lost connection. Hopefully we can get some of her insights on the chat once she comes back. But I think I'm just gonna hand it over to Julie, who will be leading us through an incredible intergenerational panel. Julie, hi.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mohieldin, as well, and to Maureen, who we unfortunately lost, but I hope that she'll be back for the Q&A question that will commence after we've heard from our panelists. But thank you so much to all three of you for kicking us off and for your really inspiring thoughts and ideas and leadership. I'm so excited to join you as we dive deeper into the topic of today's session. And Valeria just ended the last segment by posing a really interesting question about what global decision makers must prioritize. And as we transition into this intergenerational panel, I just want everyone to keep that question front and center, because it does really cut to the heart of what we're talking about here. Young countries are really caught in an impossible situation. They're spending more on debt repayments than on investing in the future of their young people, as we heard Maureen so aptly verbalize. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is really about real opportunities being stripped away from the next generation, and we just cannot afford to let another global summit like the F54 come and go without any real action. Many of these countries are also developing countries, and they are home to the fastest growing populations, just brimming with potential. By the year 2100, 3 out of 4 people will call these particular countries home across Asia and Africa, but they're constrained by financial systems that are not designed with their futures in mind. And so to unpack solutions for all of these really overwhelming challenges, we brought together a fantastic group of panelists who understand the complexities of global finance, sitting alongside some really inspiring young advocates who are living these realities. And together they'll help us explore not just the challenges, but also real actionable solutions that we can all push for in the lead up to F54 in June, July this year. So I'm really thrilled to introduce our speakers today. First, Maria Jose Romero. I'm so happy to introduce you, Maria. It's great to see you again. Maria is the Policy and Advocacy Manager for the European Network on Debt and Development, also known as Eurodad, where she leads research, policy analysis, and advocacy on development finance. We also have Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who is the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, also known as SIA, where she leads groundbreaking research on South Africa's foreign policy, South-South cooperation, and global governance since 2005. And Elizabeth also has a very crucial role in the G20 setup that I'm sure she'll talk more about once we get into the questions. We also have joining us today an amazing young leader, and I understand a fellow Dane, Gustav Christian Hansen. Gustav is an emerging voice in global economic policy and a Beyond GDP essay competition winner, recognized for his innovative work on rethinking economic progress beyond the traditional metrics. We're also joined by Hanif Ibrahim. Hanif is a project leader for the G20 Africa Expert Panel, bringing over 35 years of experience in corporate law, tax, and global financial governance. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Jacob Asser. Dr. Asser is a senior economist and strategic advisor at UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa. His work focuses on economic measurement, structural transformation, and inclusive development. So quite the panel, like I said, and let's begin with you, Maria Jose. In your work with Eurodad, you've studied how global financial institutions impact developing countries. And right now, the way money moves through the system often leave young countries high in debt instead of funding schools, hospitals, climate action, and so forth. In your opinion, what are the biggest problems with how development finance works today, and what changes are really urgently needed to make sure it actually helps and serves people? Over to you, Maria Jose.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this such an amazing panel and participants in this webinar. It's amazing to see the numbers. So in response to your question, well, the first thing to say is that the problem is definitely not the lack of money in the world, right? The problem in our perspective lies in the fact that the current global economic and financial system is outdated, flawed, and deeply unfair, with power and resources highly concentrated in a small group of countries and in financial actors. The system systematically undermines the most vulnerable, including women, children and young people, and an increase in inequality. Contrary to the political commitments to reduce inequalities between and within countries, the current rules and mechanisms, including the ones governing development finance, largely continue to take from the poor and give to the rich. The injustice reflects the fact that decisions on development finance and economic issues continue to be made in non-inclusive forums, where the global north dominates the agenda and decision-making, and global south countries in particular are not able to participate on an equal footing, and the voices of the most vulnerable are not actually represented in these forums. I would like to give just very quick examples, 3 quick examples. The first one is the highly undemocratic governance structure of development cooperation, international development cooperation, which has the OECD Development Assistance Committee at the center. This is the rich country club that sets the rules that govern official development assistance or aid, and they do that for the benefits of themselves, right? Rather than for the benefits of countries in the global south. They set the rules that govern all the aid. International financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank is my second example, which have a very undemocratic and archaic governance structure and are accountable mostly to their major shareholders and not to citizens. And the third one connects to the previous conversation, is the international debt architecture, which is very much creditor-led and fragmented. Debt is becoming a major obstacle for countries in the global south to invest in climate and development, including the most basic public services, as we heard just now. With this in mind, from our perspective, the most powerful FFD4 outcome would be to democratize global economic governance. This seems quite big, but it is very important to consider that while there might be concrete policies that could support increasing access to services, including for young people, the impact of these won't last unless we change the system, the rules. And that can only be done if we change the way decisions are made, by democratizing institutions and decisions on international development cooperation, development finance, by regulating the financial sector. And I will conclude with just some of the key policy proposals that Eurodad, as part of the civil society FFD mechanism, it's putting forward in advance of the fourth FFD conference. The first one is on debt, right, to address some of the problems that I mentioned on debt, and it's about agreeing on a UN framework convention on sovereign debt that address the necessary reforms in the global debt architecture for the prevention and resolution of debt crisis. Current calls for reforming the common framework would only reinforce the status quo of a creditor-led and fragmented debt architecture. So we firmly believe that the UN should be the place for a new legal framework on debt, and the FFD4 should be able to set the path towards that. The second is agree with all creditors to provide coordinated and unconditional debt cancellation for global south countries, for them to be able to comply with the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, the fulfillment of human rights obligations. The third one is to agree on a UN Convention on International Development Cooperation, leading to a new normative framework that democratizes the governance of aid. The problem that I highlighted at the beginning has to be addressed, and FFD4 is the place to do that. And the last one is to initiate a UN process to review the role, mandate, and governance structure of international financial institutions and multilateral development bank. This has the potential to lead to an overhaul of the international public finance architecture, because reforms led by the board of the institutions themselves where countries from the global south have been historically underrepresented, will not deliver the necessary reforms. So to conclude, 2025 is a crucial and very, very challenging year. We are seeing that. The UN Financing for Development process is the only space where global economic and financial matters are discussed in a transparent and an inclusive forum. We really call on global leaders to deliver at the conference. And we think that if successful, FFD4 would set a tone of ambition and hope, and this is very much needed. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for really outlining some of the big issues at play here. I think it's really helpful to have an overview of what the mechanism is pushing for, what civil society is sort of rallying around. So thank you so much for that. I know that one of the sort of buzz phrases is around the cost of money or the cost of finance. And Dr. Asa, I want to dive into that a little bit further. So given your role as a lead author of UNDP's Reducing the Cost of Finance for Africa report, you've looked specifically at this. You've looked at how sovereign credit ratings impact African economies, which are essentially these financial report cards for countries, and they play a part in making borrowing money way more expensive for many African countries. Why is this such a big deal, and what needs to change so young countries can access fair financing without being trapped in high interest debt? Over to you, Dr. Asa.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you for inviting me to this very exciting panel. Our report was not the first one on credit rating. There was a lot of debates, both in academic literature and in policy, about credit ratings. The normal discussion is about whether or not credit rating methodologies are biased. That's the usual story. We did our own analysis. We found some subjectivities, meaning agencies go beyond the data on macroeconomics and they have their own opinion. And if you remove those subjectivities, we calculated that African countries can save $74 billion a year, which is the total of both excessive interest payments as well as the opportunity cost, the money they don't get because of credit ratings. Why? Because when you have a low credit rating, just like a household or consumer, first, you don't get to borrow as much as you'd like because you're considered to be very risky. Secondly, what you do borrow, you have to pay higher interest rates to compensate the lender for the risk. And thirdly, even foreign direct investment doesn't want to come to your country because you consider it a bad investment. So the problem with this narrative is that it focuses only on the credit rating agencies. And it's true that they could do more, they can improve their methodologies, they can make them more transparent. But we are reminding people through our programs that there's two more players in this space. First, the countries. Many countries around the world, including in Africa where I work, are not always prepared. So they come to a meeting with Moody's or S&P or Fitch. They don't always have the right data, either because the data does not exist or there's no coordination between the ministries. They don't always send the right people, and they're not prepared to present outward and positive narrative to the agencies. So they don't necessarily have the same view of this as visits of the IMF. So through our capacity building project, right now we're helping African countries prepare better to meet with the agencies. We actually send experts who used to work for S&P and Moody's and Fitch. We pay for them to help governments in Africa to prepare better. But the third actor in this space are investors. And it's important to remember, the terms of loans to countries are not determined by credit rating agencies. They're just opinions. The investors decide what interest to charge. And there's many examples of countries with the same rating getting different interest rates, or countries with different ratings getting the same interest rate. For example, I heard that both Zambia and Spain got the same interest rate on a Eurobond, but Zambia's credit rating was much lower. How did Zambia achieve that? They went on a road trip and they presented a lot of exciting opportunities to investors and said, look, we have this project, we're investing in this and that. Investors decided, okay, well, we don't care about the credit rating. You seem promising. We'll give you the same rate as Spain. So there's a lot more we can do than just complain about the rating agencies. And that's what we're trying to do at UNDP.
Thank you so much, Dr. Az. And I understand that there's a proposal for an African credit rating agency on the table as well, which is exciting. Elizabeth, I want to bring you in now. So we hear a lot about these big financial institutions like IMF and the World Bank, but emerging economies, including China, India, South Africa, where you reside and are from, are creating new ways to fund development. And given your work on South-South cooperation, how could these alternative finance models better support young countries, especially in tackling issues like climate finance? Over to you, Elizabeth.
Right, thanks, Julie. And again, a very big thank you for inviting me to this panel and for speaking to what I think is a very young audience, which is really exciting. And I'm looking forward to the comments and questions. So I think the first point to make is, of course, that say 20, 30 years ago, when we talked about South-South cooperation, we thought it was a very contained, limited sort of set of technical, often technical activities and support among developing economies. I think over the last 2 decades, that has changed really fundamentally. And I think it's related really to the rise of a number of very important emerging economies. First and foremost, of course, among those is China, but we've also got India coming, Indonesia, South Africa has been an important player in the field, but I think at a much lower level than some of the bigger emerging economies, both in terms of population and economic size. And what that has done is that it's created additional and alternative options for financing of development. And it has also created opportunities through the establishment of new institutions. Some may call them parallel structures, where you can actually, you're in better control of the rules and regulations that govern these bodies. And perhaps an interesting example, although it's a small bank in comparison to some of the bigger multilateral development banks and certainly the World Bank, but an interesting example is the New Development Bank, which came out of the BRICS grouping, and that set out and said, well, we're going to support infrastructure and sustainable development. We're going to adopt a system that says, well, if we can lend in local currency, we can. So that addresses some of the debt issues, although clearly that's not the only, that in itself is not a solution, and often borrowing in local currency is not necessarily, depending on what you want to do with the money, it's not the be all and end all. And it has created a structure in the NDB where the 5 founding members don't have a particular quota depending on the size of their economy, but are actually equal partners in that. So this is the NDB, and it's small. I mean, if we just look at what it's lent so far, you're looking at an amount of about just under $33 billion. It's 96 projects. The money isn't huge. It has some important priority sectors in climate, like supporting clean energy and energy and efficiency and environmental protection, but it's not a major. It's not going to change the landscape significantly, but it highlights a different way of doing things. And I think at this juncture, where we know the huge size, that the amount of money that is required to not only meet the Paris Agreement targets, but also sustainable development goals in the next 5 years, we really need to think out of the box. We also need to look at the old institutions and rethink how these institutions are governed, because they were created for a different era. And this is a very different time. Not only is it a very different time that has evolved over the last few years, but it's become even more different in the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So I think we have to think out of the box. But I mean, maybe just to give you a couple of stats which are really interesting in terms of how some of these new actors are playing in that field. And as I said, China is probably by far the most significant actor. It has created both platforms as well as a diversity of mechanisms and instruments to provide and to scale up financing. Of course, in the African context, one of the most important platform is that is FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, but there's obviously also the Belt and Road. They have a number of policy banks. There is, of course, the NDB, which resides in Shanghai, but it's a BRICS bank. And then, of course, there's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is again, it's a multilateral bank, but certainly a Chinese initiative. And there again, the AIIB has provided and has committed to also supporting a lot of green infrastructure investment, with the target of reaching about 50 billion of its lending by 2030 going into green infrastructure. So we have a very diverse, an increasingly diverse environment. India has also, with a smaller pool, created an India, I think UN India, a fund that focuses on small island developing states and on LDCs, and you have other initiatives also in the Gulf states. Let's not forget some of the support that they provide, and so we have alternatives. But I think the important point, and here is where I want to end, and it's really reiterating what Maria Jose and what Dr. Mohieldin has said earlier. We can't at this point replace the big IFIs, even though these mechanisms of South-South cooperation are becoming more important. And really the bigger challenges are around how we manage, say, for example, the energy transition, which is really about shifting economies. How we manage that in the context of these major global structural issues that are very much part of the FFD discussion and really require reform and probably rethinking, which is, I think, what Maria Jose was saying, whether it's the cost of capital. And this is something that is on the South African agenda, and Hanif will probably speak to that just now. It's about the quality of financing, so the degree to which we have concessional versus non-concessional lending. It's rethinking repayment timeframes, especially for climate-related loans. It's rethinking debt sustainability metrics and how you assess debt sustainability. It's removing the gaps that enable domestic resource mobilization. And here I think it's important to re-emphasize what Dr. Mohieldin said, the issue of tackling illicit financial flows. You can't be saying you guys need to pay more from your own domestic resources, where some of the global regulations actually make it inimical for you to be able to raise the money domestically, whether it's about taxation of major corporations or indeed about trade mispricing, misinvoicing, and so on. And that's another area that is a priority for the South African G20 presidency this year. And lastly, perhaps just to say, one of the other things that South Africa has put on the agenda in the G20, which links to how we create additional mechanisms for raising finance where we're all contributing, is to really put on the agenda the issue of global public goods. It's a controversial issue. It's contested. We know that. It's contested both in the global south and in the global north. But it is important to try to have those conversations, those difficult conversations, with certainly the intention, and that's the idea in the South African-led development working group this year in the G20, that we can arrive at some sort of agreement around common principles that would define how we understand global public goods. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for highlighting some of the strengths of South-South cooperation, but also for highlighting the need for reform and transformation across some of the existing structures. And so, Gustav, we've heard the system is outdated. It doesn't no longer serve the purposes that we are here to sort of look into. And I wanted you to come in here because you were among the winning authors of the Beyond GDP Essay Competition, where you challenged the limitations of GDP as an indicator of development. Could you perhaps for us break down the limitations of GDP and explain how moving towards a more holistic framework could safeguard sustainable development in young countries in particular? Over to you, Gustav.
Yeah, absolutely, Julie. And I appreciate the invitation to be here today, but I also appreciate the opportunity for somebody young to come into these conversations and not only be able to listen to exceptionally intelligent people from their respective fields, but also kind of give my own perspective into my thoughts on how they've developed since I won that competition. And I think to answer your question the best, it's going back to this question of what is development in the 21st century? And I think that fundamental question is simply but yet profoundly complex. And it lies at a necessary shift in the youth's understanding of modern economic growth. So my interest in the shortcomings of GDP began in my economics textbook. It was chapter 4, public goods and externalities. You see, I struggled to grasp how benefiting from the expense of others not only equated to GDP growth, but how more troublingly that was equated with development. This concern essentially became the foundation of my essay, where I drew on Wallerstein's world systems theory, which has been highlighted in some elements here today, which describes how developed nations tend to strive at the expense of developing nations. And we examined how this process not only widens global inequalities, but also hinders sustainable and equitable growth in developing countries. Yet, however, GDP fails to account for such exploitative dynamics and instead rewards economic expansion regardless of its ethical or environmental costs, reinforcing a system measured by accumulation rather than equity. Ultimately, I believe that is the foundation for the fundamental flaw in GDP as a mere metric of development. Unfortunately, GDP continues to be used as an indicator of development and is the result of the social and economic architecture of the 21st century, built on competition where success has been defined as excelling over others, even at the expense of human well-being. This relentless pursuit of economic growth disregards the ethical responsibilities, allowing developed nations, to prosper while shifting social and environmental costs onto others, exacerbating global inequalities. And in June of last year, I actually saw this argument come to truth when I visited Ghana. You see, I signed up to go work on an aquaponics system project in southern Ghana in a small village called Krokobite. There, the Environmental Justice Foundation estimated that nearly 90% of fishing trawlers were beneficially owned through opaque agreements with Chinese corporations that bypass local fishing regulations. And the effects were detrimental to the sea. We saw fishermen out of jobs, marine resources being depleted at unsustainable rates, and we saw economic stability and livelihoods eroded. And Ghana honestly reshaped my perspective on development. It pushed me to reconsider what development should truly look like, and it pushed me to go beyond traditional economic models that often equate success with growth. So my experience in Krokobite showed me that development has ultimately become a value-driven change, about fostering resilience, sustainability, and self-sufficiency more than mere financial expansion. And that the most meaningful progress isn't necessarily represented in the data points of GDP and financial expansion, but it lies in access to education, food security, and the ability of communities to thrive without the dependence on exploitative systems. I came to see that development, in my opinion, should not be a one-size-fits-all that's imposed from the outside, but rather a process shaped by local and cultural contexts. This realization has cemented my belief that development must be understood beyond traditional economic indicators, and that true progress isn't about amassing wealth at the expense of others, but it's about ensuring that growth is equitable, sustainable, and rooted in human well-being. And it goes back to if the 21st century is to redefine what it means to be developed, we must move beyond GDP and embrace new holistic and ethical frameworks, ones that prioritize not only economic output, but the fundamental rights and opportunities that allow individuals and communities to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gustav. And of course, beyond GDP as a topic was part of the conversations in the lead up to the Summit of the Future, and work remains to be done within the UN sphere. So I hope that you will stay engaged as well. And I remember, Elizabeth, at one of the kickoff meetings for the G20 presidency, I heard, I can't remember if it was you or someone else who said the economy is for the people, which is essential, which is also what Gustav is highlighting here. And it's so simple, yet quite impactful. Hanif Ibrahim, I'll come to you now to hear a little bit more about the debt crisis. We've heard again and again the young countries are stuck in a cycle of debt, and the G20, as Elizabeth highlighted, the group of the world's biggest economies, plays a big role in setting the rules. Given your role in the G20 Africa Experts Panel, what needs to change at the global level to fix this particular debt crisis, and how can the G20 take real action to support sustainable financing? Over to you,
Hanif. So thank you very much, Julie, and thank you for having me. I recognize Elizabeth. Good to see you again. So I'm going to respond to the question in two parts. Firstly, as regards what needs to change at the global level, during the course of South Africa's G20 presidency, we will champion economic and governance reforms at the global level using an African continental perspective. The nature of our G20 presidency is best understood by looking at it as a process rather than a series of discrete events. We recognize that we have inherited a plethora of issues which has accumulated during prior G20 presidencies, the last one being, of course, in Brazil. While we may add to this bouquet of issues, we are expected to lead the G20 in managing the existing suite of issues before passing them on to the next chair. The management of these issues will be influenced by geopolitical and geoeconomic realities, and also, of course, by events as they unfold during the year ahead. It is for this reason that the G20 Experts Panel, appointed by the presidency, will seek to prioritize issues and issues that will offer some opportunity for progress during 2025. So what needs to change? I've given thought to two particular issues given the time constraint. The one, and Elizabeth would know about this perhaps more than I do, it's about IMF reform. And the second one will be about sovereign debt restructuring. These two issues, in my view, are likely to remain part of the G20 agenda even into the future. And this makes it possible for South Africa and our G20 allies to achieve some success over time. IMF reform has been on the G20 agenda since the first Leaders Summit, way back, I think, in 2008. While efforts have not led to substantial IMF governance reforms, admittedly, there has been some impact. The point to make is this: African states have long advocated for governance reforms that will make the IMF more responsive to African concerns. Efforts have focused on the allocation of voting shares and a merit-based process for selecting IMF leadership. These efforts too, again, I admit, have had some impact. For example, the 2023 IMF established a third chair on the 25-member board. And this is significant because the board usually operates by consensus. It is now possible for individual EDs to have a larger influence in board decisions than their vote would suggest. To the second part, how can the G20 take real action to support sustainable financing? The G20 has been engaged with sovereign debt restructuring since the COVID pandemic. It established the Debt Service Suspension Initiative in 2020 that offered 73 low-income countries the possibility of suspending their official bilateral debt service payments for 12 months. This was later extended to December 2021. But I submit that the DSSI was inadequate for the challenges being faced by developing countries. And to the point that Dr. Mohieldin makes, Zambia became the first African country in 2020 to default on its debt. And this was, of course, again, the point Dr. Mohieldin made. Chad followed, Ethiopia and Ghana too. Currently, 20 African countries are viewed as being either in default or in debt distress. And this is the point that I want to amplify, and I want to pick up on what Dr. Mohieldin had said. 25 countries are spending more on servicing their debts rather than on health, education, or investment. Further, the G20 established a common framework for debt treatment. This was to ensure that creditors receive comparable treatment from qualifying low-income debtor states. I mean, all of us, to an extent, know about the three-step sequence. I'm not going to spend time on that. But the problem that we have is that the common framework takes an unduly long time and is often complicated. The point was made that Zambia took over 3 years to conclude just the MOU with official creditors. I want to conclude, as regards the debt sustainable financing problem, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, acknowledged that existing debt relief mechanisms were far from adequate to address global vulnerabilities. He called on G20 nations to do more to deliver financial justice. The South African Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, echoed this, saying that addressing debt vulnerabilities would be a focus of our presidency. It is accepted that debt sustainability cannot be solved through the common framework alone. And it is to this point that the G20 Africa Expert Panel will do an assessment on the efficacy of the common framework. I thought, let me say that the G20's Africa Expert Panel will be timed to inform the position that African states take, and it will probably be shared at the 4th Financing for Development Conference later in the year. I'm afraid I'm going over my time, so just a last comment. Elizabeth probably knows much more about the cost of capital than I could ever imagine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Henny, for the thoughtful intervention and for highlighting some of the difficulties. I mean, 25 countries spending more on servicing debt than on health, education, and investment is just a very stark statistic. We have so many questions coming in to the chat, and I want to give everyone a chance to pose their questions via me. I think the team has done a tremendous job of condensing some of the questions into something that I can pose perhaps in a condensed way to the panelists. I just want to ensure everyone that the team is going through the questions. They're also trying their very best to answer them in the chat. Everything will be captured and there will be avenues for follow-up afterwards as well. But I do have a set of questions that goes to the point of the engagement of young people specifically. And I'll highlight a couple of them, and then I'll open up for some of the views from the panelists. So the first one is on how financial decisions made today can ensure long-term well-being for future generations. So this is really about having a much longer view than what we currently see applied across the globe. And what are the top 3 priorities for mobilizing finance at scale to make that happen? So that's the first. Second, young people under 18 will also feel the effects of global economic disparities and policy decisions, even if indirectly, especially as many grassroots organizations are led by young people. How is the UN processes and perhaps also the G20 processes, we have some insiders with us today, ensuring that children and adolescents are not left out of financing discussions and global economic policies? And then I have just one last one that I'll pose here as well. How can we actually mobilize funding at scale? And what can young people do to keep this on the radar? What are the top 3 most important steps needed to agree at F54 to make sure money reaches the right places? So central for this is the ability for young people to engage, how to keep this on the radar, how to engage with the processes, UN, G20, and elsewhere. And again, a call for sort of a prioritized focus on what are the most important things. And I know you've, in your different interventions, highlighted this a bit already, but for sure, I need to drill down a bit further to get young people involved to push for these particular priorities. Anyone who dare to go first on these very prudent questions? Yes, Dr. Asa, go ahead.
Thank you. I think young people can not only engage, but they can actually help us. They can lead us, because even though we all work in international organizations that try to do a lot of good, a lot of the thinking and discussion about financing for development is stuck in the 19th century, or at least in the pre-1973 era of the Bretton Woods gold standard. We need more pluralism in economics. And in the 2008 financial crisis, you saw a lot of young people get up, creating the Young Scholars Initiative, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, calling for pluralism in economic curriculum. But day to day, when we work at different UN organizations, World Bank, we just practice neoclassical mainstream economics and use GDP, like Gustav said. And there's a lot more out there. There's post-Keynesian, there's institutional, there's Minsky economics. Even the whole concept of finance as something that needs to be mobilized is gold standard based. Finance is just a legal tool that can mobilize new resources. So I would tell our young leaders, if you see any movie this year, watch Finding the Money. It stars one of my favorite economists, Stephanie Kelton, who wrote the book called The Deficit Myth. So we need a lot more new economic thinking, and young people are, in my experience, much more open to that than some of our older colleagues. So we need your help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asa. Elizabeth, I saw you agreeing vehemently. Do you want to come in as well?
No, I mean, I think Jacob put it out there correctly. I think the interesting turning point was around 2008, where I think a lot of the paradigms, some already knew that they were faulty, but I think 2008 and then what followed, I think really cemented the fact that we needed to look at these things very differently. And I think the points that and the issues that Jacob have highlighted are, I think, speak very much to that. And we do, it is about breaking the mold, and I think, the point that you made, Jacob, about, we still think in a particular way when we come up with policy choices is so much the case. But I think this is now starting to be tested and to be broken, I hope. But it's happening, I think, in sort of defined spaces and not across the board. But the way it can build up into a movement is really for all of us. And this is intergenerational, who actually see that this is highly problematic, that the templates of the past don't work, actually to keep pushing. I mean, a few years ago, the issue of beyond GDP wasn't on the agenda. It is now very much on the agenda. Has it moved sufficiently far enough? No. But I mean, both young voices and older voices who are on the same page really need to push for that. And just to say, one of the things that certainly bodies within the UN, and particularly DESA, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, is pushing, is exactly that, sort of thinking out of the box, breaking down the orthodoxies of the past, and actually also identifying value where value should be, rather than one that is determined by consumption and growth and so on. Perhaps just one observation to make about the involvement of young people. I think, and I'm going to refer to it from some of the work that we at the Institute have been doing with young people, including young people in high schools. It is so important, and also so absolutely stimulating and gratifying to see how young people, given the opportunity to engage and to be in those spaces, actually grab it with both hands. And what does grabbing with both hands mean? It means they engage, they read, they try to understand what the issues are and the context, so that when they're sitting at the table, or when they are pushing to be at the table, or when they're protesting outside, they are actually doing that with a lot of knowledge, with the ability to actually argue the point and to respond to people who may come at them with different with different arguments. And that's been one of the amazing things in some of the work that we've been doing through our Youth at SIRE program, is to really see that passion and that motivation, which is not just about going out there and saying, you know, you got to include me, but I'm going to be included because I know the issues and I understand the issues and I come at it from a perspective of the younger generation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Gustav, I was wondering if you had viewpoints on this, being new to the conversation in some ways, and what have you sort of experienced? Do you have any particular guidance or advice on this issue as well? Go ahead. And then I'll come to you, Mahia, afterwards.
I just want to say, like, Elizabeth, you spoke really well to the topic, I think. And I think you really nailed it on about the value of having these intergenerational conversations. You know, when I begun and I was given the first opportunity to go to one of these events and speak, I didn't see what my value was, and I didn't see what the contribution I could have to the conversations were. Immediately, I was thrown into the deep end with representatives of NGOs and the private sector challenging my thoughts on it. And from that, what I realized is that it's invaluable. Adding the youth to the conversation, it flourishes into these exceptionally valuable conversations, and sorry, the word I'm looking for here, but no, I'll give you an example. So last time I went to the UN, I was presented with speakers from all around the world, the Club of Rome, the president there, Sandrine Dixon-Leclerc. She was exceptionally well spoken on business and morality and business ethics, but we also had a young woman from Mexico who represented an indigenous tribe. And we spoke about, yes, moving on beyond GDP, but also about values, how GDP and development is become value driven, right? And what that means is essentially one development in Africa or development in a developed country should not look the same, right? Because we're looking to preserve culture and historical context. So she spoke a lot about how we put value on how there's no representation for the value on what the indigenous hold value to in Mexico. And I think having gone to all these conversations, it's become exceptionally invaluable that my thought and my exposure to all these conversations just continues to build. And it's thought-provoking.
You're silted, no?
What's that?
I think that was Hanif. He's on mute again. Continue, Gustav.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like Elizabeth said, and like what's been spoken about here today, getting youth into the conversation will be vital moving forward. But I also think the earlier we get them in, the earlier we expose them to the environment where their thoughts are challenged, but they're learning and hearing the conversations among some of the most educated within their respective fields, the more impact we will have in the long term.
Thanks so much, Gustav. Maria Jose, over to you as well. I see that you are dying to get in. I was wondering if you could perhaps also say something about the avenue for young people to participate in the FFD CSO mechanism, if you're able to. I think that would be wonderful. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, previous interventions were really, really inspiring. And in addition to your point, Julie, I really want to make a very strong case for global leaders to actually engage young people because they have, it's part of their duty to inform citizens about why, for instance, the financing for development process at the UN is such a crucial process. It's very important that leaders engage young people, listen to them, think about their needs when developing policy proposals for FFD4. It has to be clear that this is not about an agenda for just a 1 year time span. It's a long-term project, and global leaders should use this opportunity to engage young people constructively and actively into this conversation, because from our perspective, it's crucial to avoid that the conference delivers for the already powerful group of people and countries, right? So young people are already very active in so many spaces, climate, gender, against austerity. And even in the civil society FFD mechanism, we do have a website, our social media channels for young people to engage, and I will certainly encourage them to engage even more, to connect to the civil society actors in their countries, right, at national level first, at the region as well. There are regional networks, the network in Latin America, Latindad, the network in Africa, Afrodad, and so on, right? And then at the global level, the mechanism offers a platform for young people to engage. There is now a Jubilee campaign with widespread mobilization and plans to mobilize throughout the year. And the Jubilee campaign is calling not only for debt cancellation, but also for the transformation of the debt architecture. So I would certainly encourage young people to also engage with that platform. You can Google Jubilee campaign, and that would be there, right? And it's very important that young people connects to and amplify CSO calls for a change. For a systemic change, and not just for piecemeal approach solutions that could be just a quick fix today, and not the ones that will provide long-lasting solutions, right? So certainly we are very much keen on engaging young people in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And Hanif, I'll come to you as well, give you an opportunity to answer this. But so there's for sure an opportunity to engage with the FFD CSO mechanism. There's also the major groups and other stakeholders mechanisms. There's a major group on children and youth that I saw very active last week during the PrepCom for FFD4. You, Maria, and others have mentioned other platforms as well. I think one thing to highlight is what you just said, Maria Jose, as well, is the necessity to also engage nationally, right? And I think that one of the things that we see here is that there is a real sense of a lack of urgency, in particular in the global North capitals. And this is where young people can play a crucial role. And like Dr. Azza said, really lead the way by pinning down what the problems are, putting pressure on the decision makers, having them show up in these international forums to make commitments and agreements that will have an impact across all of these different topics. That doesn't just happen magically here in New York at the UN. It does really start nationally at home with pressure and policymaking in capitals and in local environments. Hanif, I'm wondering if you want to come in here with a few words perhaps on G20 opportunities as well.
Thank you, Julie. I thought maybe just to add that young people are not just beneficiaries, but they're also key contributors to sustainable development. I mean, from the discussion, I am aware of youth-led initiatives, innovations, and tapping into funding, mentorship, and platforms for collaboration. I mean, Julie, you mentioned the UN Foundation. I thought there's some great work at the future agenda. And I also thought, just listening to the fellow panelists, Maria Jose, Gustav, Elizabeth, and even you, Julie, as you just summarized it earlier, I thought you more or less covered the ground that we needed to hear in terms of youth participation and mobilization. In respect of the G20, the Africa Experts Panel will still have its inauguration meeting in the next few days. We simply have identified the stakeholders, and of course, youth is a critical element of that. So various sectors, various formations, and various partnerships will be explored in dealing with the issues that the Africa Expert Panel will during the duration of the G20 presidency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanif. And we are almost at the end of our time for this particular panel before we move to the closing of this entire session. I have just a very quick question that I wanted to pose perhaps to just a few of us so we don't go over time, but I think this is crucial in conversation around ODA, official development assistance. So here goes. With donor countries providing billions in aid, there are still major concerns about how funds are distributed, monitored, and assessed by grassroots change makers. So this is, again, ties us to the local level where a lot of young people are operating. Should donor nations be required to allocate a fixed percentage of their GDP to aid, perhaps around the 0.7 conversation? Is this still something that we're pushing for? And how can we reform global finance to ensure funding reaches those who need it most while maintaining transparency? So I know a big question, but perhaps just a few words on where we are on ODA and what we should be pushing for here. Maria Jose, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The question is very much connected to my initial intervention. Rich countries have committed to deliver 0.7 of GNI, gross national income, back in 1970, but only few of them have delivered on their commitments. The rules that govern ODA, as I said before, are very much decided at the level of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. So building and a group of people that meets in Paris and set the rules for how ODA is being channeled, defined, etc. So this is deeply problematic, and this is why we want to change that to a setting that it's led by the UN and not by the OECD, because at the moment we see that commitments are not being met. The quality of development assistance has deteriorated over time, and even the statistics of official development assistance are increasingly useless because they do not represent the real amount of resources that reach developing countries in the global south that should be the ones that benefit from these resources, from the historical legacy of colonial times, right? So I think that these are some of the things that have to be corrected, and the FFD4 conference could be the place to set up a path for a new governance of aid where commitments are met, and where rich countries are being held accountable for their commitments, right? I think that the world of official development assistance is suffering a very important shakes at the moment with major decisions in the US. So there is not the same word that we are used to have in the field of development assistance. There is a lot of work to do for us to change that for the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Jose. And I'll make an executive decision here and wrap up our panel discussion so that we have time for our last intervention. But thank you so much for highlighting those particular concerns. It's crucial to really keep the focus on the development assistance. The trend is upward, but the amount of money that actually goes to developing countries is down. So I just want to express again my gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists for their insights and for their, and of course as well to our engaged audience who posed so many brilliant questions in the chat. All of your contributions are invaluable, and we look very much forward to FFD4. I hope that you all will stay engaged, and the team at the United Nations Foundation are always ready to engage and assist and further elaborate on some of the conversations that we had here today. So I want us to now transition to a very inspiring segment of the day, our creative closing. Policy and advocacy are powerful, but so is storytelling. And today we are very honored, excuse me, to introduce someone whose words have moved audiences across the world. Miriam Bukhar Hassan, also known as Anis Islam, she's a poet, a spoken word artist, and gender advocate from Borno State in Nigeria. She has used her platform to inspire change, empower young voices, especially young women in northern Nigeria, and challenge the status quo. Through her poetry, she reminds us that advocacy isn't just about policies or reforms. It's about the lived experience of young people fighting for a better future. Alhan Islam, over to you. You're still muted.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Is this better?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for sharing all the speakers that I listened to, so powerful. Thank you so much for inspiring us. So the poem that I have for you today is titled The Weight of Tomorrow. And it basically talks about how, you know, we have shackled economies due to unfair ratings. So here goes The Weight of Tomorrow. We stand at a crossroads where asphalt turns to dust and the dreams of nation hang in the balance, where the ink of contracts seal futures unseen and the weight of debt presses against the chest of those not yet born. They call them young countries, as if youth is a privilege and not a sentence, as if being rich in spirit can pay the price of shackled economies, as if resilience alone can build bridges where the river of inequality runs deep. In Africa, in Asia, where the sun kisses the foreheads of tomorrow's leaders, where the soil births crops and ambition, where hands weave futures with nothing but hope and necessity, we watch the scale tip. We watch the scales tip and they do not tip in our favor. Here, 50 to 80% of the people are under 30. 50 to 80% of tomorrow waiting for a future that was mortgaged yesterday. And how does a nation breathe when every exhale is a loan repayment? How does a mother feed her child when her currency is worth less than her prayers? How does a child dream when the classroom crumbles before the lesson begins? They tell us the system is broken, but no, it was built this way. Designed in boardrooms where our names are statistics, where our futures are footnotes, where wealthier nations extend one hand in aid while tightening the noose with the other. Debt relief, a dangling key that never quite fits the lock. Promises, scattered like loose change, never enough to buy transformation, and yet we're still here. We are the continent of revolution. We're the architects of possibility. We do not beg, we build. But building requires more than brick and bone. It demands a new system, a new blueprint, one where financing is not a leash but a lifeline, where development is not delayed but deliberately designed, where the young do not inherit debt but dignity. So we ask, no, we demand. How do we reshape the system so it serves us all, not just a few? How do we ensure sustainability is not a privilege, but a promise? And how do we make accountability not a whisper, but a roar? We are not here to be saved, we're here to lead, and the time is now, and the future is financed today. And history will remember who stood, who spoke, and who dared to rewrite the rules. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Alhan Islam, you are amazing. I couldn't think of a better way to sum up this session. Thank you so much for those words. As we wrap up, remember, we do not ask, we demand. Let's make the scales tip in our favor. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day.